The first crack appeared when Mark came home early from work. It was a Friday afternoon, and I wasn't expecting him until much later. I had just walked Ryan to the front door, our goodbye kiss lingering longer than it should have. My heart was racing, but the house was quiet. I thought I was in the clear. But as I turned back toward the living room, there he was, Mark, standing in the entryway with his briefcase in hand and an expression I couldn't read. My stomach dropped. "Who was that?" he asked, his voice calm but sharp. I froze. My mind scrambled for an explanation, but the words wouldn't come. Ryan's cologne still lingered in the air, and I knew Mark could smell it. "Just a colleague," I finally said, forcing a smile. "He needed help with a project." Mark didn't respond right away. He set his briefcase down slowly, his eyes locked on mine. "A colleague," he repeated, his tone colder now. "And why was a colleague leaving our house on a Friday afternoon while I'm at work?" I opened my mouth, but the lie didn't come fast enough. "Do you think I'm stupid?" he snapped, his voice rising. "I saw you. From the car. I saw the way you kissed him." The words hit me like a punch. I couldn't deny it, not when he'd seen it with his own eyes. My knees felt weak, and for a moment, I thought I might collapse. "Mark, Save it," he interrupted, holding up a hand. His face was a mix of rage and pain, and it was clear there was no turning back. "I want the truth," he said, his voice trembling. "How long has this been going on?" I couldn't lie anymore. There was no point. "A few months," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might explode. But instead, he just nodded, as if something had finally clicked into place. "Get out," he said. "What?" I asked, stunned. "I said get out," he repeated, his voice shaking with anger. "I need you out of this house. Now. Mark, please. Now," he roared, slamming his fist against the wall. The sound echoed through the house, and I flinched, my body trembling. I grabbed my purse and keys, tears streaming down my face as I stumbled out the door. The last thing I saw before I left was Mark standing in the hallway, his hands clenched into fists, his face a mask of betrayal. I had no idea where I was going or what would happen next. All I knew was that the life I thought I could control was unraveling faster than I could handle. I sat in my car, parked on the side of a quiet street, trying to process what had just happened. Mark had caught me. Not through some careful investigation or slow suspicion, he had seen it. There was no spinning this, no chance of covering my tracks. For the first time in months, I was completely exposed. After sitting in silence for what felt like an eternity, I drove aimlessly, unsure where to go. Ryan's place seemed like the obvious choice, but the idea of seeing him right now made me sick to my stomach. I couldn't bear to face the man who had become the physical representation of everything I had done wrong. Instead, I drove to a hotel on the other side of town, checked in under my name, and collapsed onto the bed. That night, I barely slept. My mind replayed the look on Mark's face when he confronted me, the disbelief, the anger, the pain. He had always been so steady, so predictable. Seeing him that way, unhinged and broken, made me realize the depth of the damage I had caused. The next morning, I woke up to find a string of missed calls from my sister, Rachel. My stomach twisted as I realized Mark must have told her. Sure enough, when I finally picked up, her voice was sharp and full of judgment. "Hannah, what the hell is going on?" she demanded. "Mark called me last night, completely destroyed. He said you've been cheating on him. Is it true?" I took a deep breath, knowing I couldn't lie to her. "Yes," I said quietly. "It's true." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a long sigh. "I don't even know what to say to you," Rachel said, her voice thick with disappointment. "Why would you do this? Mark doesn't deserve this." "I know he doesn't," I said, tears welling up in my eyes. "I don't have an excuse. I don't know what I was thinking." "Well, you'd better figure it out," she said sharply. Because he's not just angry, Hannah. He's done. The weight of her words settled over me like a shroud. Mark was done. The thought of losing him completely, of ending a 10-year marriage over something so selfish and fleeting, was unbearable. Meanwhile, Mark wasn't just sitting at home brooding. He was taking action. On Monday, I received an email from him with the subject line, "Next Steps." It was brief and clinical, laying out his immediate plans. He wanted space, so he'd be staying in the house while I figured out a more permanent living arrangement. He was meeting with a lawyer to discuss separation, and he expected me to cooperate fully. The coldness of his words stung more than I expected. Mark wasn't just angry, he was done with me emotionally, treating me like a problem to be managed instead of a person he had once loved. But the worst part wasn't the email. The worst part came later that day, when I got a call from my boss. "Hannah, we need to talk," he said, his tone unusually formal. "There's been a complaint." "A complaint?" I asked, confused. "Yes," he said. "Mark sent an email to HR this morning. He attached screenshots of some texts and emails between you and Ryan. He's accusing you of engaging in an inappropriate relationship with a coworker." My blood ran cold. I had never thought Mark would go this far. I knew he was hurt, but this felt like a calculated move to destroy not just my marriage, but my career. I don't know what to say," I stammered. "Well, you'll need to say something," my boss said. "We're launching an investigation. In the meantime, you're on unpaid leave." Unpaid leave. Those words echoed in my mind as I hung up the phone. Mark wasn't just taking revenge, he was dismantling every aspect of my life piece by piece. Over the next few days, the fallout continued. Ryan texted me, panicked, saying he'd been called into a meeting with HR. He begged me to tell Mark to back off, but I ignored him. I didn't have the energy to deal with Ryan's problems when my own life was in shambles. My friends, most of whom were mutual friends with Mark, started distancing themselves. Texts went unanswered, calls were avoided, and social media posts that once included me now conspicuously didn't. It was as if I had become radioactive, untouchable. Even my parents, who had always been my safe haven, were struggling to process the news. My mother called me one evening, her voice trembling as she tried to understand. "Hannah, why would you do this?" she asked. "Mark has always been so good to you. What were you thinking?" "I wasn't thinking," I said, my voice hollow. "I was selfish and stupid." "I just don't understand," she said. "We raised you better than this." Hearing the disappointment in her voice felt like another nail in the coffin. I had expected anger, maybe even outrage, but this quiet sorrow was worse. The turning point came when I received a letter from Mark's lawyer, outlining the terms of our separation. It was clear he had no intention of reconciling. He wanted a clean break, and he wasn't going to make it easy for me. The letter also included a request for me to vacate the house within 2 weeks. It was official now, there was no going back. I had destroyed my marriage, and Mark wasn't interested in picking up the pieces. As I packed up my belongings, the reality of my situation began to sink in. Every box I filled was a reminder of the life I had thrown away. The photos of our wedding, the souvenirs from trips we'd taken together, the little notes he used to leave me, each item was a testament to the love we had shared and the trust one had shattered. By the time I left the house, I was a shell of the person I had been just weeks earlier. My marriage was over, my career was in jeopardy, and my relationships with friends and family were strained at best. And yet, this was only the beginning of the fallout. Mark's revenge had started, and I had no idea how far he was willing to go. I avoided Mark as much as possible after the letter from his lawyer, but it was inevitable that we'd have to face each other at some point. The confrontation came a week later, when I returned to the house to collect the rest of my things. I thought he wouldn't be there, but I was wrong. The moment I stepped through the door, I heard his voice from the kitchen. "Didn't think I'd let you sneak in and out unnoticed, did you?" he called out, his tone icy. I froze, clutching the box I'd brought for packing. He appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, his face a mask of controlled anger. "I'm just here to grab my stuff," I said quietly, avoiding his gaze. "You mean the stuff you didn't earn?" he shot back. "The stuff I paid for while you were screwing around with your coworker?" His words hit hard, but I bit my lip and said nothing. I knew better than to argue. "Why?" he demanded, stepping closer. "Why did you do it, Hannah? Was I not good enough for you? Were you bored?" "What?" I set the box down and finally looked at him. "It wasn't about you," I said, my voice trembling. "Don't give me that," he snapped. "Everything we had, everything I gave you, and it wasn't enough? You just had to go and blow it all up?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I don't have an excuse, Mark. I messed up. I wasn't thinking about what I had, or what I was risking. I was selfish, and I hurt you. I know that." "Selfish doesn't even begin to cover it," he said, his voice rising. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You didn't just hurt me, you humiliated me. You destroyed everything we built together. And for what? A fling? Some guy who doesn't even give a damn about you." I flinched at his words, but I knew he was right. "I never meant to hurt you," I said, tears streaming down my face. "That's the problem, isn't it?" he said bitterly. "You never thought about me at all. You didn't care what this would do to me. To us." "I do care," I insisted. "I made a mistake, Mark, but I care about you. I always have." He laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You've got a funny way of showing it." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with all the things we wanted to say but couldn't. "I just want to know one thing," he said finally. "Was he worth it?" "No," I said immediately. "He wasn't. It wasn't about him, Mark. It was about me, my own insecurities, my own selfishness. And I hate myself for it." He shook his head, his expression unreadable. "You should." I wanted to reach out to him, to beg for forgiveness, but I knew it was pointless. The damage was done, and there was no fixing it. "Do you know what the worst part is?" he said, his voice trembling. "I still love you. Even after everything you've done, I still love you. And I hate myself for that." Hearing those words broke something inside me. I had taken his love, his unwavering loyalty, and thrown it away for nothing. "Mark, Don't," he said, cutting me off. "Don't say anything. Just pack your things and get out." Packing the rest of my belongings was excruciating. Every item I picked up felt like a piece of our life together, slipping through my fingers. Mark didn't leave the room, he stood there, watching me with a mix of anger and sadness. When I picked up a photo frame from the mantel, a picture of us on our honeymoon, he scoffed. "Take it," he said sarcastically. "Something to remember what you destroyed." I put the frame back down, unable to look at it. By the time I finished, the box was full, and I felt emptier than ever. I turned to Mark one last time, hoping for some sliver of understanding, some sign that he might eventually forgive me. But his expression told me everything I needed to know. "Goodbye, Mark," I said quietly, my voice breaking. He didn't respond. He just turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with the weight of my choices pressing down on me. That night, as I sat alone in my new apartment, I replayed the confrontation over and over in my mind. Every word, every look, every ounce of pain I had seen in Mark's eyes haunted me. I wanted to believe that time would heal the wounds, that one day we might be able to have a civil conversation, or even rebuild some kind of relationship. But deep down, I knew that was a fantasy. Mark wasn't just angry, he was broken. And I was the one who had broken him. The reality of what I had done was finally sinking in. This wasn't just about an affair. It was about the trust one had shattered, the love I had taken for granted, and the life I had destroyed. I had hurt the one person who had always been there for me, and now, I was paying the price. Mark wasn't content to simply cut me out of his life, he wanted me to feel the full extent of the consequences for my betrayal. It started subtly, with things I thought were just logistical fallout from the separation, but it quickly escalated into something far more deliberate and calculated. The first sign came the day after our confrontation. I received a notification from the bank that Mark had closed our joint account. I hadn't touched the money, knowing full well that it was as much as mine, but now I couldn't access a single penny. Even my personal savings had been siphoned out through automatic transfers I had foolishly authorized months ago. When I called the bank, they confirmed that Mark had removed my name from everything we shared. I had moved into a small, run-down apartment to save money, but now, with my financial resources dwindling, even paying rent felt uncertain. My workplace hadn't reinstated me after Mark's email to HR, and the investigation was dragging on. I was stuck in limbo, financially crippled and unable to defend myself without a lawyer I could no longer afford. But that wasn't the worst of it. A week later, I discovered Mark had reached out to my parents. It wasn't just a call to let them know about the separation, it was a full disclosure of everything. He emailed them the same screenshots of texts and photos he had sent to HR, meticulously detailing how I had betrayed him. He didn't hold back, framing his narrative in a way that left little room for them to see my side of the story. When my mother called, I could hear the strain in her voice. "Hannah, we need to talk," she said firmly. "What's going on?" I asked, even though I already knew. "Mark sent us some concerning things," she said, struggling to keep her composure. "Is it true? Did you really cheat on him?" I couldn't lie to her. "Yes, it's true," I admitted quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. When she finally spoke, her voice was laced with disappointment. "How could you do this, Hannah? To Mark? To yourself? What were you thinking?" "I don't know," I said, my voice cracking. "I wasn't thinking. I made a mistake." "A mistake?" she repeated, incredulous. "This isn't forgetting to lock the door, Hannah. This is your marriage. Your life." My father was less restrained. He called later that night, his tone cold and sharp. "Your mother and I are ashamed," he said bluntly. "We raised you better than this." Hearing those words broke me. My parents had always been my biggest supporters, and now, even they had turned their backs on me. The fallout spread further. Mutual friends stopped answering my texts or returning my calls. Invitations to events and dinners suddenly disappeared. Mark had made sure everyone in our social circle knew the full extent of my betrayal. I became a pariah, isolated and shunned by the people I had once considered my closest allies. Even at work, things got worse. Though I had hoped HR would handle the situation discreetly, word spread quickly. Whispers followed me whenever I went to the office to meet with the investigators. Colleagues I had once been friendly with now avoided me, their judgment written all over their faces. Ryan, the man I had risked everything for, had been fired during the investigation. I didn't hear from him again after that. It was as if he had disappeared, leaving me to deal with the fallout alone. Part of me hated him for his silence, but another part knew he wasn't to blame for the mess I had created. This wasn't about him. This was about me, and the choices I had made. The most shocking blow came 2 weeks later. I had just returned to my apartment after another humiliating meeting with HR when I found a package waiting for me at the door. There was no return address, but I recognized Mark's handwriting on the label. I opened it hesitantly, unsure of what to expect. Inside was a neatly organized binder. As I flipped through it, my heart sank. It was a comprehensive compilation of evidence, emails, text messages, photos, and even a timeline of events, meticulously detailing my affair with Ryan. At the back of the binder was a printed copy of the letter Mark had sent to HR, along with a list of everyone he had shared the evidence with. There was also a note. "This is who you are now. Own it." I stared at the binder, unable to process what I was seeing. Mark wasn't just ending our marriage, he was dismantling every part of my life, ensuring that I felt the consequences of my actions in every way possible. He wanted me to suffer, and he was succeeding. For the first time, I felt truly helpless. This wasn't just about losing Mark or my marriage. It was about losing everything: my reputation, my support system, my stability. I had nothing left. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the binder on the table in front of me. The weight of my choices crushed me, and for the first time, I allowed myself to truly feel the depth of my guilt and shame. Mark's revenge wasn't just punishment, it was a mirror, forcing me to confront the person I had become. I thought about calling him, begging for forgiveness, but I knew it would be pointless. Mark didn't want an apology. He wanted me to understand what I had done, to feel the pain I had caused him. And he had succeeded. I spent hours going through the binder, page by page, reliving every mistake I had made. By the time I reached the end, I was a wreck, my body shaking with sobs I couldn't control. I wanted to hate Mark for what he had done, but I couldn't. This was my fault. I had brought this on myself, and now, I had to live with the consequences. 3 weeks after Mark's binder arrived at my doorstep, I hit my breaking point. The silence, the isolation, and the weight of his relentless retaliation left me with no sense of direction. I knew that if I wanted any hope of rebuilding my life, I needed closure. I needed to face Mark one last time, even if it meant opening wounds that were barely starting to scab. I called him first, unsure if he would even answer. To my surprise, he picked up on the second ring. "What do you want?" he asked, flatly, his voice devoid of warmth. "I need to talk to you," I said. "In person." "About what?" he said, his tone skeptical. "Everything," I replied. "I need to explain myself. I need to apologize." There was a pause on the other end of the line. I held my breath, waiting for his response. "Fine," he said finally. "Tomorrow, at 6. Come to the house." The next day, I arrived at the house that used to be my home. As I stood on the front porch, I felt a rush of memories: holidays spent together, lazy Sundays on the couch, the day we signed the mortgage papers, full of hope for the future. All of it felt so far away now, like a life that belonged to someone else. Mark opened the door, his expression unreadable. He didn't say a word, just stepped aside to let me in. The house looked the same, but the warmth was gone. It felt cold, sterile, as if he'd stripped it of anything that might remind him of me. We sat in the living room, facing each other across the coffee table. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I didn't know where to start, and he didn't seem inclined to help me. "I'm sorry," I said finally, breaking the silence. "For everything." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You think sorry fixes this?" he asked. "You think it changes anything?" "No," I admitted. "It doesn't. But I need you to know how much I regret what I did." "I wasn't thinking about how it would hurt you." "That's obvious," he interrupted. "You weren't thinking about me at all." "You're right," I said, forcing myself to stay calm. "I wasn't. I was selfish, and I let my insecurities get the better of me. But I never wanted to hurt you, Mark. I never stopped loving you." "Don't," he said sharply, holding up a hand. "Don't say you love me. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have lied to my face, snuck around behind my back, and destroyed everything we had." I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I pushed it down. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," I said. "I know I don't deserve it. But I need to know, is there any chance we can find a way to move forward? Even if it's just as friends?" Mark stared at me, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "Friends?" he repeated. "You think I could ever be friends with you after what you did?" "I don't know," I admitted. I can't stand the thought of losing you completely." "Well, you should have thought about that before you decided to cheat," he said coldly. "You made your choice, Hannah. And now you have to live with it." His words cut deep, but I couldn't argue with him. He was right. I had made my choice, and it had cost me everything. I've lost everything, I said, my voice trembling. My marriage, my job, my friends. I know I brought this on myself, but I don't know how to move forward. That's not my problem, he said bluntly. You made your bed, Hannah. Now you have to lie in it. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Finally, he stood up and walked to the window, his back to me. I loved you, he said quietly. I gave you everything I had, and it still wasn't enough for you. It wasn't about you, I said, my voice breaking. I know that's hard to believe, but it's the truth. You were always enough, Mark. I just didn't see it until it was too late. He turned to face me, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and anger. You're right about one thing, he said. It is too late. This, he gestured between us, is over. It's been over since the moment I saw you with him. I understand, I said, tears streaming down my face. But I need you to know that I'll spend the rest of my life regretting what I did to you. He didn't respond. Instead, he walked to the front door and opened it, a clear signal that our conversation was over. Goodbye, Hannah, he said, his voice firm. I stood up, my legs shaky, and walked to the door. I paused for a moment, hoping he might say something more, but he didn't. I stepped outside, and he closed the door behind me without another word. As I drove away, the reality of our final conversation sank in. There was no hope for reconciliation, no chance of repairing what I had broken. Mark was moving on, and I had to find a way to do the same. But as much as I wanted to hate him for his coldness, I couldn't. He had every right to feel the way he did. I had betrayed him in the worst way possible, and he had given me far more grace than I deserved. That night, I sat in my apartment, replaying our conversation over and over in my mind. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of clarity. This wasn't about Mark anymore. It was about me, about taking responsibility for my actions, learning from my mistakes, and finding a way to rebuild my life. I didn't know where to start, but I knew one thing: I couldn't stay stuck in the past. Mark had closed the door on our relationship, and now it was up to me to figure out what came next. After that final conversation with Mark, there was no illusion left about where we stood. I had pushed him too far, and I had no one to blame but myself. His goodbye was definitive, not just for him, but for me. If I was going to survive this, I had to stop clinging to the idea of redemption through him and figure out how to rebuild my life on my own. The first step was addressing the mess I'd made of my career. The investigation at work had concluded, and while I wasn't terminated outright, I was demoted to a lower position. The whispers and judgment didn't stop, though. Even casual interactions with coworkers felt loaded with unspoken accusations. The day Ryan was fired, I knew any association with him would stick to me like a stain, even if I stayed. I resigned a week later. The relief of leaving was immediate, but it came with the daunting reality of finding new work in the middle of a scandal. My savings were already thin, thanks to the financial tangle Mark left me with, and my prospects weren't much better. Each job interview felt like walking into a trap, wondering if the interviewer had heard about the mess I'd left behind. After dozens of applications and a few humiliating rejections, I finally landed a job at a small company outside my previous industry. The pay was modest, but it gave me a clean slate. No one there knew me, no one whispered behind my back, and I could focus on proving my worth again. It wasn't ideal, but it was mine, and I clung to it like a lifeline. While my career stabilized, my personal life remained a wreck. My parents, though supportive on the surface, struggled to fully forgive me. Every phone call with them was laced with subtle disappointment, as if they were still trying to understand how their daughter had become that woman. I visited them once after everything came out, and the strained silence during dinner was enough to make me swear off in-person visits for a while. My friends, if I could even call them that anymore, had all but disappeared. Mutual connections with Mark were gone, and even those who weren't close to him seemed wary of being associated with me. I spent most weekends alone, avoiding the outside world as much as possible. It was during one of those long, solitary weekends that I decided to seek therapy. I needed someone to talk to, someone who wouldn't judge me or throw my mistakes back in my face. Finding the right therapist took time, but when I did, it felt like the first real step toward healing. In therapy, I began to unpack not just the affair, but the years of dissatisfaction and avoidance that led to it. I realized how long I had ignored the cracks in my marriage, how I had blamed Mark for things that weren't his fault. I had used Ryan as a distraction, a way to avoid confronting the issues in myself that I was too scared to face. My therapist didn't let me wallow in self-pity, though. She made me confront my actions head-on, challenging me to take full accountability without making excuses. It was painful and exhausting, but it forced me to grow in ways I hadn't thought possible. Months turned into a year, and slowly, I started to feel like a different person. The shame didn't disappear, but it became more manageable. I learned to live with the mistakes I'd made, to accept that they were part of my story without letting them define me entirely. I even started reaching out to people I had hurt, not to ask for forgiveness, but to acknowledge the pain I'd caused. My parents were the first. During a visit last Christmas, I sat them down and apologized for the embarrassment and disappointment I had brought to the family. "I know I've let you down," I said, tears streaming down my face. "And I know I can't change the past, but I'm trying to be better. I just hope you can see that someday." My father, usually the harsher of the two, nodded slowly. "We're still angry," he admitted. "But we're also proud of you for owning up to it. That takes strength." It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a step in the right direction. Next, I reached out to Rachel, my sister, who had been one of Mark's staunchest defenders. She had barely spoken to me since the affair, but to my surprise, she agreed to meet. "I still don't understand why you did it," she said over coffee. "But if you're really trying to change, I guess I can respect that." Her guarded acceptance meant more to me than I could put into words. Mark was the one person I didn't reach out to. I thought about it often, wondering if enough time had passed for him to hear me out. But every time I picked up the phone, I stopped myself. He had made it clear that he wanted nothing to do with me, and I respected that. I did hear about him from mutual acquaintances, though. He had started dating someone new, a woman he met through his gym. They seemed happy, and as much as it hurt to know he'd moved on, I was glad he had found peace. As for me, I stayed single. I wasn't ready to date again, not because I didn't want companionship, but because I knew I still had work to do on myself. Trust, loyalty, and self-awareness weren't just things I needed to rebuild with others, they were things I needed to rebuild within myself. Now, 2 years after everything fell apart, my life looks completely different. I have a new job, a small but growing circle of friends, and a stronger sense of who I am. The pain of losing Mark hasn't gone away entirely, but it no longer defines me. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that mistakes don't have to be the end of the story. They can be a beginning, messy, painful, and full of regret, but a beginning nonetheless. I'll carry the weight of my choices with me for the rest of my life. But I've also learned to carry hope. Hope that I can continue to grow, hope that I can rebuild trust with the people I care about, and hope that someday, I'll find happiness again. Mark deserved better than what I gave him. I know that now. But for the first time in years, I'm working to deserve better from myself, and that's a start.